Hey, how's it? POA. Welcome to episode 99 of the Cool Project Podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Aipa. Mahalo for being here. The Cool Project Podcast focuses on educating, empowering, and engaging with the community around what it means to live ku. In the Hawaiian language, ku simply means to stand upright, to be grounded, anchored, to exist. So when I speak about living ku, I speak of standing tall and strong within yourself and what you stand for, being the strongest version of yourself. In this episode, I sit down with Coach Alyssa Chang to learn more about the different ways that we can cope with the stressors that we experience throughout life. We learn about the 4F responses to stress and share some personal stories of our experiences dealing with stress. Here is episode 99 with Alyssa Chang. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Cool Project Podcast. I'm sitting here with Coach Alyssa Chang. And if you've been listening to me before, she was, I think, back in 2019 or 2020. And we talked stories about so many different things, so especially with what's going on personally as well, like learning how to rest better and how to kind of deal with the stresses that come with life, with all these things that are constantly piling up within our work life, our family life, social life. Just trying to figure out how to cope with all these stressors that come across. So Alyssa, so thankful for having you here today. And, before we even start, can you just introduce yourself really quickly for those who don't know you yet?
Yes, thank you. Well, first off, thank you for having me back. Yeah. Always so honored. So my name is Alyssa. I work as a neuroscience health coach. A lot of my clientele is mostly online, trying to really establish much more of a local community here on Oahu. So my background is played sports, then did a little stint in bodybuilding, navigated a lot of health issues related to that restrictive, no pain, no gain type of mentality, which forced rest on me. I, mentally didn't want to rest. My body really gave up and started to really show a lot of symptoms where rest was essential. But I take this nervous system approach to health and healing. So understanding that our nervous system and our brain and body are always working for and with us. And how do we utilize our body and those symptoms as tools to better attune to our intuition, access feelings of safety, truly and authentically feel like we know ourselves and how to rest, move, fuel, recover the best we know for our individual self.
Yeah. And I think that's so important when you mentioned right there, the individual self, because sometimes I feel like too many things kind of do a blanket over everybody, like everybody follow this rule, this law, rather than focusing on the individual and seeing where they're at and how can we help you and how can, like, what tools do you need, You mentioned about working out and all that stuff. And I remember we mentioned the last time about you got to focus on working in before you start working out. Because like you said, I kind of went down the whole thing, right? I got into strength conditioning, did a whole performance stuff, got into bodybuilding as well. Because you wanted to just test yourself. I think that was the drawing thing, was like I was an athlete all my life. And then all of a sudden, when we're not playing sports, I was like, okay, what do I do next?
Who am I?
Yeah, who am I? Like, what do I do now? Like, I'm so used to going to practice and training and having a competition. So what do I do now? So I think that's why I kind of pushed myself further, because I wanted to keep that kind of edge and like physically, but you lose sight of the mental aspect of it,
Like, are you happy?
Yeah, are you happy? Is it just exactly what you want to do? Or do you just feel like this is what you have to do, in order to like fulfill some kind of void in your life?
Yes.
Right? But I think that's, I think you hit it on the nose, like having that moment, trying to become more self-aware.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of us tend to have problems with, is to having that moment of self-awareness to stop, rest, and actually reflect a little bit more to slow things down.
Yeah. And you actually, yesterday when we were chatting, you had mentioned that in many scenarios, we get to the point where we're forced to, right? We have to take that pause because our body is alerting us of all these symptoms, right? We're constantly getting sick. We have pain that doesn't leave our body. And so how do we get to a place of self-awareness where we're not forced to, right? Take that time off there, that day off. So a lot of the skills you have to curate for yourself in self-awareness is slowing down.
Yeah.
But the hard part with slowing down is a lot of us, again, move in that very accelerated pace because it has felt very safe for us. And we've maybe created an identity with being a very productive, high achiever, type A type of person.
Right.
So shifting out of that can initially be very threatening to our nervous system, that maybe we feel more stressed in the slowing down, which is ironic, but it actually makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I think that's where, even like today, where we're getting a constant flow of information, especially digital information, news, it's just a constant input that's going into us, and we don't have any way to actually process all that input, which can cause a lot more stress internally.
Yep.
We don't know where to release it or let go of it, especially when you come across heavy news.
Yeah.
Even though you're not personally affected by it, you still feel something, it still hits you in a certain way. How do we cope with that? What do you do? Like for me, I'm always about nature. When I feel like I'm down or I'm like overwhelmed, in Hawaiian culture, we could say kaumaha, like feeling a weight on our shoulders, I immediately go into nature or the ocean or take a walk into the mountains, just to kind of create space so I can create space within,
Yeah.
And so I think that's so important for people to find that self-awareness. When they do feel that, do something that kind of, like I say, re-energizes your mana, because you feel down, our energy feels low. We don't feel as impactful sometimes. We feel a little bit more lonely. So what can we do to feel better?
And I think it'd be great to create context around why we're feeling that like low grade fatigue or depletion. And you hit the nail on the head where it's like we actually have these mirror neurons, and our brain actually can't compartmentalize the stress we're viewing through our phones on social media or through TV. Like we can't shut off our mirror neurons, but we can, right, turn off the TV.
Yeah.
We can create better boundaries around social media. And there's this individual balance for a lot of us where we want to stay informed, but we also want to protect what we know can be really triggering for us. And as you mentioned, really start to deplete our own energy resources, that then we're noticing it impact our relationships, our business, our productivity in ways that's not like, again, overproducing to the point of fatigue, but just feeling like ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's really about, again, that caretaking and how do we create the stepping stones, for us to just really become more aware of like when we're activated. And then what are our go-to strategies? Like for me, similar to you, I can just place my feet on sand and I automatically feel my whole body just exhale. And I'm like, here you are.
Yeah.
I get back into being in like a very present moment. And it's almost like kind of confrontational because I'm like, oh, you have not been in your body all day.
Yeah.
Like you've been in this very distracted, triggered, overwhelmed state.
Yeah, and I think that's where people have a hard time, right? Is when they slow down, because that's when everything's kind of unloads, right? Because we get so busy by distraction.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden when it's kind of settled and it's quiet and you're still, and that's where everything starts to flow out, and you don't know how to categorize or how to even like process all that information, and then who knows what happens from there, right? Everybody's different. And I think that's so important for us to talk about that.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be more discussions about that, because there's this whole concept around this pushing ourselves, this go, like kind of got to hustle, kind of do it. No pain, no gain kind of thing, and for me, there's a time and place for everything, but I remember when I was training, one of the coaches told me, you have, what was that? I'm trying to remember this now. It's kind of the workload capacity cannot exceed your capacity to recover. So whatever you take on, you have to make sure you have the capacity to recover from that, and the processes and the tools in order to do that. So whether it's walks in nature, cold showers, or whatever you need to do, meditation, stretching, exercise, you have to have those tools in line to help you with processing that stress that you're dealing with, and the trauma and everything.
Yeah, it makes me think of a couple of things. One thing you and I align really well on is, we come from a background of movement, from athletics as well. So we've utilized our body from a performance standpoint of like, what can I push my body to do?
Yeah.
And as we've shifted out of athletics and stepped into the health and fitness space, and also felt alarmed by what the messaging was in the fitness space, we kind of adapted this mentality around like, well, your body's actually this really powerful resource to help process, to hold, to feel emotions.
Yeah.
Yet because so many of us are disconnected, distracted, we lose that ability to trust that we can actually hold anxiety, we can hold discomfort and fear, and that nothing bad will happen on the other side of that. If, again, we have the supportive caretaking tools set in place, which could be nature, which could be connecting with someone. It could be alone time, right? It's so specific, and it's really about learning yourself so that you can then insert the rest and recovery tools for yourself. The second thing that came to mind was I actually proposed this question to one of my clients because we were navigating if she should work out, not work out, the should questions.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, what if we were to reframe it to, have I rested enough to do the things that I love? And it helped her really start to understand how essential rest is for her to perform at her best in her work, as a mother, as a partner, as a friend. And so, I would entertain that question for many of you that are struggling with understanding what that happy balance is between output and input.
Yeah.
Because if we can rest optimally, we're going to show up into all the areas of our life in alignment, as well as really fulfilled, present in our body, and then in connection to the people that matter. Yeah,
I think that's where we always talk about, in order to take care of others, we need to focus on taking care of ourselves. And a lot of the work that I do with the Coop Project, that was like the foundation of it all, because we constantly see people who we love and who are always taking care of everybody else. And sometimes they do it too much to the point where they get sick, they get ill, and then everybody's like, oh, you should have been taking care of yourself better, and sometimes it's too late when they're already doing that. And so that was kind of where my focus has always been on making sure people take the time to learn about themselves, build a better relationship with themselves. Understanding is like, yes, we enjoy giving aloha to everybody else, but make sure you give aloha to yourself, because sometimes you're just constantly in a state of giving. You got to give time to yourself as well,
And the interesting and hard part about that, right, is you and I probably relate to this. When you start to take care of yourself, it's very normal to feel like this is like ridden with guilt. You feel selfish. And all we want to create the expectation around is it's like you're learning a brand new skill.
Yeah.
So it's going to feel weird. It's going to feel awkward. It comes with a side of guilt, but we can just notice it. We can name it. And what you really want to be in awareness of is like, again, this is a normal process as I'm relearning how to take care of myself. And the more that you are just gently doing that, and that could be literally, I'm going to take a minute longer in the bathroom before I have to get out and cook all my kids' breakfast. It's that it will reteach your nervous system and your whole existence of like, I'm worthy of my own time.
Yeah.
And when I do this, I have a little bit more patience around my family. I have a little more energy when I'm driving to work. And so you start to see all these little progress markers that can hopefully validate that, like, yes, you are so worthy of the time that you spend on everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminds me of the story that I tell often about one of the guys that I used to work with. And he was always very tense, and he's a construction worker guy, big, strong, always. He had this whole thing about how he was working for his family, providing for his family. That was his big thing that we always talked about. And he didn't say very much. And I remember one day I was kind of like, why are you here? Like, you're strong, you're fit, there's other ways that we can help you, but why'd you come? He's like, I just need a place where I can just be. As time goes on, we built a better relationship with him. I kind of finally asked him, like, hey, what's one thing you haven't done in a long time that brought you joy? And immediately he's
beautiful question.
And he immediately said, I used to paint a lot. I used to do art and draw and everything. I said, when was the last time you did that? He was like, probably high school. Because I had to start working and I just had no time for that. So I gave him a challenge. I was like, all right, I challenge you. Because some guys like challenges. I challenge you to
Great Ray, read in the room.
Yeah. It's like, I challenge you to paint this week. That's it. I didn't follow up with him. He kind of shrugged it up. He kind of laughed and kind of like, whatever, and then we left it at that. But then as time went on, I think it was about 2 months later, the wife texted me and she says, like, Coach, thank you so much. She's like, he's painting again, but now he's gentler at home. He's not as impatient. He's calmer because he's painting. it's that whole reconnection, right? You have to relearn about reconnecting with yourself, because he got into a point where everything he had to do was for other people. Like, what I'm doing, I have to do this because I have a responsibility for this. So he put himself to the side and forgot that part of him, you know. But when he did that, all of a sudden he felt more connected. He was patient. He wasn't as like quick-tempered, you know. Right there was that simple process, right? Painting.
Yeah. And it's like, oh, it made me think of like so many things of just, again, you use the word responsibilities.
Yeah.
And we all carry responsibilities, especially if, you know, we are a parent and we have kiddos. And there's a lot of like love and ownership that we take pride in. And the hard part with that is that there are going to be times where, maybe your kids' priorities are going to be at the top. But I like to create the visual of like, imagine that you each are like little figurines that are on a table. And let's say you're getting your kids ready for school and like maybe you literally don't have time for breakfast. You just push your figurine off to the side. She doesn't fall off the table. She just gets pushed to the side a little bit. So your needs and your kids' needs still exist on the same table. Once they go off to school, then you're like, oh, okay, I'm going to slide my figurine right next to the rest of the family and enjoy my breakfast. Because it's not about hierarchical, right? At times, again, there may be a shift in priorities, but it's like, how do we remind ourselves, create a trigger to reassure ourselves that I still matter. Like my needs can exist at the same level, the same table as everyone else I take care of. And it's a helpful way to just kind of visualize, like, where are you in this like figurine family? Are you on the ground or where are you, you know? But I just want to acknowledge like your ability to even ask that question of like, what do you do for fun? Like doing things that we enjoy for play, for fun is a form of rest. We lose sight of hobbies. We lose sight of being out in nature and playing. And that is just such a wonderful way to reconnect to ourselves. And like, again, from a physiological standpoint, like your hormones are just like, oh, this feels great. Like we haven't done something that wasn't structured or had to be done at a certain amount of time or in a perfect way. We can paint, you know?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to kind of the whole self-awareness and self-reflection. And what do you think causes people to be afraid of that?
Of becoming self-aware?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I
mean, because that can be, that sometimes is like the barrier for some people. Is like they don't want to take that moment of stillness to self-reflect.
Yeah, so one of the questions is like, I always like to ask is, what are you afraid of learning on the other side of being still? And as we mentioned, because we're in a culture where we're always distracting away from being with ourselves, there's a skill in being able to spend time with yourself, right? Taking yourself on a solo walk, even just sitting with yourself, not on your phone, not on TV, not distracted, just with your thoughts. And I think that can be a really scary place for a lot of people to live. And so distraction has become a form of really protecting themselves from, right, the fear, the anxieties, the ruminations. So I do feel there's a lot of detachment from the body, which then doesn't feel like a safe vessel for them to like process all the discomfort. And I think that it's just, again, it's really a coping strategy that has been developed. But what if we learn on the other side of sitting with stillness is that we have anxiety. And then it's like, oh my God, what do I do with this? Like, am I ready to address this? And maybe we're not as resourced. Maybe we don't know where our first step is. So sometimes there's like the fear-based response.
Yeah. You know, and I remember we mentioned about the ways of resting, right? And trauma and stresses and everything. You have the 4 Fs. Right?
Yeah.
Can you kind of share about those 4 Fs? Because I remember you mentioning them. I can't remember. I know one is fawn. That one stuck out to me. Fawn.
Why?
Freeze. Yeah.
Why, Daniel?
I don't know. It just sounded interesting to me. Can you kind of share about those? 'Cause I think that's, like you mentioned, like giving name to certain things, and how you feel and how you rest is so important. You know?
And it might give a nice kind of container for people to understand, like, oh, I relate to that, and this is how I can rest. So your nervous system has these default trauma responses. I like to coin them survival responses because I think sometimes trauma can feel really like heavy to name and identify with. So these survival responses, the first one is a fight response, which we commonly hear. So that's typically where we kind of armor in reactivity. We get angry, defensive, we seek out control. And the best way to really rest and self-soothe for that trauma response or survival response is actually like, you don't need stillness. Like, imagine being super angry and then someone's like, go meditate. You'd be like, are you crazy? Like, I'm fuming right now. So what you actually want to do is I always recommend my clients take these like power rage walks where you put on headphones, you play like some music that has like a lot of beats and a lot of tone. You play it and you power walk. And you're moving with that level of activation. So your nervous system and your body are like, oh, she sees me, she hears me, she knows I'm revved up. And what you'll notice is after in like a power walk, you come home and you're like, oh, I can regulate. I feel more in my body. So that's the fight response. I'm curious as I name these, which one you're like, oh, I relate to that.
That one right there.
Oh, yeah.
It's so funny because like we always, even my family always laughs at me about this because they're like, Dan, you're so calm. Like, but sometimes I know there's a storm inside, I was like, oh yeah. But for me, it's doing things like that.
Yes.
Like training and going into the gym when it's like 96 degrees and like just working out,
Yeah.
Just getting some release of releasing it,
It's the releasing for sure.
Because I've been approached times where I've shared with people like how like I just have all this tension and aggression. They're like, oh, you seem to meditate. And I was like, if I meditate, it's going to even build up even more.
Yes, exactly. So you're not wrong. We want to say this to the people that have tried. You're not wrong.
But right
meditation
there,
doesn't
kind of
work.
just made me realize, like, okay, there's one way,
One way, and then again, the self-awareness of like what survival response is activated in this moment, because you might identify with all four of them. And it's just given what triggers you that then you're like, oh, I'm in my fight. I'm in my fawn.
And I think also important to realize is that we have to figure out what's a positive outlet for that stuff.
Yes.
Because I feel like a lot of times, especially with some of the work that I do, I find that many people are in that fight response, but they take it out in other ways.
Yes.
Such as violence or substance abuse and all those different things as a way to feel like a release.
Right.
When it's not really.
Yeah, like exercise addiction can come into play, right? You mentioned, working on really hot temperatures, but imagine if you didn't have as many resources or the self-awareness you have, you could reach a place of burnout or overtraining because you're always searching for that release through exercise and really hot temperatures. So at some point you're then navigating like injuries, right? Or like dehydration, like all of those things. So there's definitely this balance of like, okay, like healthy coping strategies and these other strategies that are just becoming like detrimental. Yeah. So the second one is the flight response. So I like to define it as you're actually moving like this really activate state towards something. So people often coin it as like you're escaping, you're running away, you're avoiding, but I always like to think about it. You're feeling this level of activation. You need to like do something with it. So that's my busy bodies. You're like cleaning the kitchen at like 10 p.m. You're like decluttering your closet, right? You're just busying your mind. Your schedule's always really packed, constantly multitasking. And this is where we were sharing earlier, where sometimes stillness can be really activating for this type of response as well. So I like to recommend for this type of activation, like you can just acknowledge, you're like, oh, I'm in my flight response. I am scrubbing I literally have done this before, like with my toothbrush.
It sounds like you, this is like,
identifying it, right? I like with my toothbrush in my bathroom, it's 10:30 at night and I'm like cleaning my bathroom sink and I'm like, I just kind of like giggle at myself. I'm like, you're just in your flight response right now. You don't want to sit with your anxiousness. And I just the fact of naming it, like it brings a sense of like normalcy to my own system. So you can continue on with the busybodiness, but probably a more supportive strategy, let's say it is late at night like that, is this is where like gentle movement really plays a beautiful kind of like pairing with this level of activation. So this is a nice like, instead of like a stillness meditation, maybe it's a meditation walk. And there's like, I use the Calm app. There's a bunch of these beautiful meditation guided walks, a nice movement flow as well. You kind of want to, I would say from a input from your auditory system, it's really good to have like calming tones and music at this level. But those are probably more of the supportive strategies for the flight.
Right. Oh, interesting.
The fawn response is where we are people pleasers. We are the peacekeepers. We have learned at a very early age that our needs didn't matter. What was more important for us to basically survive in a place of conflict was to make sure everyone else is okay, right? So you're the mediator. You're never asking yourself, what do I need? You're really looking and scanning the room of like, who do I need to be in order to diffuse any tension in the room? And so the fawn responders, what they actually really, really will probably have a harder time working on is the self-awareness piece, because they're so accustomed to being attuned to everyone else You could ask a fawn responder like, oh, how do you feel today? And they're like, oh my God, I have no idea. They don't know. But you could ask them, how's your sister doing? And they're like, she didn't sleep well last night. And I think it's because the baby did da. And they'll go through this whole detailed story. And you're like, oh, that is interesting.
Interesting.
So they're really well practiced. They're usually the really empathetic people in a room.
Yeah.
They're very intuitive. You usually probably feel really seen by them. So I feel like you're a little fawn.
Yeah, I'm a little fawn.
Yeah. You have a very like calming, grounded presence. And like you had described earlier, maybe your system is navigating a lot of internal activation, but you're able to maintain like this very calm energy, which feeds into the last response too.
Yeah, I think for me, that's always kind of been how I grew up, being the mediator. Even my dad always say, oh yeah, Daniel's the peacemaker of everything.
Oh yeah.
He was one who was always kind of making sure everyone's okay. But I think that was just, I don't know what caused that to happen. I mean, growing up too, I didn't speak very much, I didn't.
Observing?
Yeah, I was more observant.
Yeah.
And I didn't say very much. Like even in school time, I was kind of more the observer, just kind of making sure, seeing what's going on. And even if I wasn't a part of something, like I would feel. So I think that's why it stuck out to me, the whole fawn thing. Just like,
were you team captain on your sports teams?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
So
I feel like that type of personality, usually if you're able to like kind of mold who you need to be in front of someone, right?
Yeah.
You have learned to shapeshift regarding who's in front of you, which again is both a wonderful trait to have, because again,
but
you can make a lot of it's exhausting.
It's very exhausting.
Yeah.
But it goes back to what you mentioned before, right? The mirror neurons.
Yes.
Like having those mirror neurons to relate, so that the person that you're speaking to can feel an energy coming to them, and then they can be like, okay, maybe a little calmer.
Right.
Or if I want to have them like more activated, then we can activate it.
Totally.
So that's all. That's interesting for people to hear about the whole mirror neurons, right? Kind of, because
it's done all day.
We do it all the time, but people don't realize that.
Yeah.
And what we watch too, right? That's an energy source coming towards us that has an effect on our nervous system.
Yes.
And then we're going to mirror that. So if we're seeing violence and rage, we're going to feel violence and rage.
Yeah. Totally. You wonder why you don't sleep.
Exactly.
It's not like you could have the perfect bedtime routine, but if you consumed a lot of media that was really like, again, activating, your whole body is like, we were the ones that were like fleeing this event, and witnessing this and that.
I don't know. Sometimes like when late at night when we're watching TV before bed, like I can't watch like those like really intense stuff because then I can't sleep.
Of course. Because makes so much sense.
Because I'm running through Dungeons and Dragons and everything. It's like, but it makes total sense, right? Like we start to feel what we see, and then so the last one is the freeze response. So you might kind of relate to this one too. The freeze response is a big demographic I work with. So they're typically the ones that learned again at an early age to really disconnect from any type of experience they were having. And this can be good or this can be bad. Yeah. So these are the tendency, or this personality survival response has a really hard time experiencing like both beautiful ends of the human experience. Like they may have a hard time feeling gratitude and happiness, and vice versa on the other side, pain and like discomfort, all of those other feelings. And this is because they are so accustomed to numbing out whenever they feel something, because their brain's like, this isn't safe. Let's disconnect. Let's go off on a spaceship. Let's remove ourselves from our body. But as you and I know, right, your body is such this vehicle to experience your life, your world, like all the beautiful encompassing of emotions that we can have experience in our life. So freeze response, the thing that's commonly misunderstood is they appear very calm on the surface, and exactly what you named earlier, but they are navigating so much internal chaos. So that external kind of calming presence, but the internal activating. Now, imagine that happening at the same time. Yeah.
You are so overworked, so depleted. The fawn response or freeze response tends to be exhausted. But you often get the blanketed statement of like, oh, you're always so calm.
Yeah.
Or like, why are you not reacting to this? And they are reacting. It just doesn't present itself in the way that we know reactions and quotations should look like. So how the freeze response actually, there are a couple ways that you can actually rest for this survival response. One is sometimes you need less input. So that's like putting on sunglasses, wearing a hat, a hood, comfy clothes, noise canceling headphones. Your brain is just taking in too much information that we need to like eliminate as much input so that you can actually self-regulate. Or what you actually need is like a gentle reintroduction of sensation. So this is where it gets a little nuanced. So for you, Daniel, you can think of when you may have been in like, oh, I don't feel connected to myself. Do I need to go to the ocean, smell the ocean, feel the sand between my toes, water on my feet? Do I need that type of input? Or do I need to like lay in bed, lights off, heavy blanket on me, take some deep breaths?
Yeah.
Right? So there's like two ways that you can self-soothe this trauma response, but it just depends on like, again, your level of understanding yourself to then experiment, with which one.
See, thank you for sharing those, because I think that's a lot of people can kind of probably rewind this again and listen to those things and figure out which ones they fall into, right? Because now we're naming it, and now we're giving them the tools that they need to start figuring out for themselves, because it's an individual approach, right? Whatever works best for the individual. I think that's what's so important of the work that you do, is that you focus on the individual, because everyone's so different and everyone's dealing with things differently. Like for me, I remember one of the things that I have a hard time to with is whenever I go to talks, like people are like, oh, you do so many talking events and everything. And I was like, that's probably, when I go to a speaking event, that's probably one of the most like high anxiety moments for me. I remember I went to one, and I was pulling into the parking lot to it, and all of a sudden I kind of just like drove to the parking lot looking for, there's parking stalls everywhere. But I just kept driving, and I drove out of the parking lot, and I just went around again. I did it twice.
Yeah.
Because just didn't want to stop. And then finally I parked, and I sat there, and I got out of the car, and the person who invited me to speak saw me do it. They're like, I was wondering what was happening. I was gonna call you saying that you weren't lost, but I was like, okay, something's going on. So I was like totally upfront with them about it. Yeah. And they're like, oh, that's so cool that you're actually just like being so open about it,
Yeah, which more people need, right? That reassurance that like it's not you. Like you're not the only one that needs to drive through a parking lot a few times.
Yeah, when there's all parking everywhere, and all of a sudden you're just like, okay, just keep going around.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, whenever I have to do something public, I like literally turn on Bruno Mars's "Fly Is Me" song, and I'm like, it's really loud in my car. I'm like singing along to it. But it's like we all have these like ways where we're like creating reassurance for ourselves, right? And like as you mentioned, just being able to name that you're like, ooh, I parts of me identify with being a fawn response, a freeze response. It's like validation is such a beautiful foundation to any type of healing health work, right? When we can feel validated in our experiences, we take away the shame, the judgment, what's wrong with me statements. And then from that place of validation, we can be like, oh, okay, I now can move forward in the self-awareness next step, Yeah.
I think right there you mentioned too, like having that space where you can do that. Because sometimes people have a hard time finding that space, or finding that community, or finding an area where they can express themselves freely without feeling judged, And I think that's where it's very important for people to search for that, search for those spaces where you do feel safe, or if you're lucky enough, you have a community already or friends that allow you to express yourself freely,
Yeah, and I'd love to ask you a question. I think that, what does it mean to you to feel safe in a community, safe in like a relationship and environment? Because I think examples might help people be like, oh, that's what I should be seeking out.
Yeah. For me, it's the safest I feel is when I think probably, what was that, last week, Thursday, like that was probably the best I felt in a while, is when I was just sitting outside with family, and I wasn't even like part of it, and just hearing them talking, laughing, and playing music, because it was just that feeling of belonging, and again back to feeling like, okay, this is familiar, this is happiness, and I wasn't even participating. I was just sitting on the outside looking in, and I felt safe, and I think those are the moments that we strive for. Again, I was disconnected from things. I didn't have my phone on me. There was no TVs on. It was just, you're out in the open, feeling the wind, and then you hear this laughter and singing, and it was calm too. It wasn't like a party was going on. It was just kind of capilla, this like moment right there was just kind of like, it was nice. That was like my safest moment. Then the other moments would be more of if I'm just sitting alone, to be honest.
Yeah.
You know, like when it's quiet, even if it's just sitting alone in my house, you know, reading a book. I'm like, I can get lost in a library. You know, like bookstores are one of my favorite things. But people ask, oh, so what's your favorite book? It's like, well, I don't really read books.
Yeah.
I just like to be in the bookstore.
Yeah.
You know?
So actually, be interesting to just unpack that in more detail. Like, what about like being in a bookstore? Like,
It's that feeling of being lost within everything that's going around. I think that's why people like, for me, I like, because there's a lot of distractions, but I can just be at the same time and no one's going to bother me. Stillness within chaos.
Yeah.
And that to me can sometimes feel calming.
Yeah, and that is a reflection of the work you put in on yourself, right? Because to maintain a sense of calm while there's, again, like you use the word chaos and like a lot of stimulation outside of you, like that is someone that is really like regulated and has a great sense of connection and grounding in themselves.
Yeah. So and then when I know when I'm not feeling good is when I'm in that situation and I can't focus.
Yes.
Because I'm worried about, okay, who's coming in the door and everything.
Yeah.
And so that's, again, going back to self-awareness, right? It took me a long time to figure that stuff out.
Yeah.
A lot of mistakes, a lot of emotions that you have to feel. But I think that's one of the most challenging things for people to do.
Yeah.
Dealing with your emotions and having to acknowledge it and confront it is hard.
Yeah.
When it came down to realizing, okay, well, why do you feel afraid to ask questions, even today? Being in the work that you do and having to ask somebody a question, why do you have that sense of anxiety? Or you want to fly a flight, the feeling of flight. I said, oh, that goes back to when I was a kid, being ridiculed for how I spoke. I had a speech impediment and I couldn't hear, so I didn't want to ask questions because I'll be made fun of. So even to today, I hold on to that feeling. But then as years goes on, it goes better and better, right? Because you acknowledge it and you realize that, okay, no, this is part of the process. This is part of healing process is to start asking questions and ask for help, which is like another thing that, right? Yeah, which totally. When you go back to the fawn thing, right?
Yeah,
it's like
asking for help.
Asking for help.
Fawners are like, no, I'll just run myself to the end of the road.
I got it.
Yeah.
So, but I think, but what about you? Like, where do you feel safest?
Yeah, it's, I love that we're sharing our individual perspectives because I hope it helps people understand that like you are, again, going back to it, you're so unique, right? Like what makes you feel safe, me feel safe, Daniel feels safe it should be different.
Yeah.
So what makes me feel the safest is definitely a certain type of person. It's also a certain type of people. So I'm less of a sit me in a coffee shop with a lot of stimulation. I think that can be a little bit more, I'm like a little bit more activated. Like I'm definitely the person's like, oh, I kind of hear all these sounds. If I had headphones on, like that might make me feel more connected to myself. But I think because I default to being a little bit more of an empathetic person and I'm very attuned to my environment, like being in this space, your home, it's like quiet. There's beautiful natural light. We can see the trees blowing out in the wind. So I think there's like a piece of nature. There's quietness. The temperature is beautiful. So I'm tapping into all these different sensory inputs. And to me, I'm like, oh, I feel safe. You're a very non-judgmental person as well. You come to the space with a sense of regulation, which is also a very key indicator of safety, is the people you're around, are they regulated? Yeah. Because if you're in a room and this person's like in, like, let's name all the like trauma responses, right? This person's in fight, this person's in flight, fawn and freeze, and you're there, your nervous system's going to attune to all of those other nervous systems. But if you meet someone that's super grounded, then you're like, oh, this is safe. And so I think when it comes to who you share your time with, be very intentional about that, because you can create safety based off of an interaction with one person. Co-regulation is the word I use. So there's co-regulation in a safe way, and there's also co-regulation you can co-regulate in a more fight way, in a flight way, So it's being very aware of like, who do I want to spend that time with? Because are they helping me feel safer in myself? I do appreciate non-judgmental spaces, people that are very accepting, and I can read that pretty soon off the bat with like eye contact, body language. So all of those like subtle invitations that you are safe here. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to like really accept you. I want to share this one quote that you had mentioned the word belonging that made me think of. Brene Brown, who's like this shame researcher and storyteller. She talks about how, the differences between fitting in and belonging. So fitting in, you step into a room, you're looking at everyone in the room and you're asking yourself, who do I need to be in order to fit in?
Yeah.
Versus belonging is you show up to a room and you immediately don't have to shapeshift, try on a different mask. You're accepted. You get to belong just based off of who you are. So you're not trying to change your character. You're not trying to attune to other people. You just get to show up and be accepted.
Right.
And I think when you use the word belonging, more people need spaces where they are truly able to belong and not have to shift.
Yeah, I think because that whole shape-shifting thing is exhausting. I remember as a coach, when you're dealing I used to coach at a university, and you're dealing with hundreds of athletes, and as a coach, you're trying to bring out the best of them, right? But each individual is different, responds to different things. Some of them need a more calmer approach. Some of them need a more intense, a fiery approach. So I remember I had to go and be basically shapeshift all day, depending on the team, depending on the individuals, depending on the coach. If the coach is even there, how would it react? So it's always about just trying to, again, read the room, understand the energy that's going on how do I best transform myself to change the environment, to bring out the best. But I remember after coaching those days, I'll be spent, I'll come home, I'll have no energy to even like go and see people. I'll just I just need space,
Yeah.
And then, but that's where I think that was when I started to become more self-aware, because there was points where I felt like I was just so out of myself, and that I didn't know who I was, because constantly go from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m, just going. And I think that was the point where I had to figure out for myself, okay, where am I now? I had to, how can I work on regulating myself again?
Yeah.
And that's kind of where a lot of design came, being more creative on writing and everything started to come out even more, because I wasn't doing that stuff.
Yeah.
I was just coaching, trying to figure out how to be the best coach, how to get the best athletes, researching all that stuff, but I wasn't doing any of the creative work. I wasn't designing, I wasn't writing, I wasn't sketching stuff. And so when I started to bring that back into my life, that's when I started to become more regulated.
Beautiful. Another question that comes up for me, my demographic of clientele that I work with is predominantly women. And I have a handful of male clients, and, a very interesting component to, I think, your wealth of knowledge and background is this, let's dismantle this, definition around what, a female should carry in her responsibilities and expectations in the world, and what also, a male identity should also carry. So I'm kind of curious to hear just, the work you've put into your own self-development, around being open to share. I had to drive around the parking lot twice because I was anxious, right? It takes a certain type of person to get to that place where then we also normalize, right? Hey, even though I'm brought in to be a speaker on this workshop event, I'm still nervous. I'm human, Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to a lot of the work that I've done I work with a mixture. It's almost 50-50 women and men, but for a lot of the guys that I work with, a lot of it has to deal with trying to break down those barriers of even acknowledging those moments, of weakness, quote unquote weakness.
Yeah, totally.
Or not feeling like they're powerful, or they're a man anymore, right? Oh, what do you mean you're scared? Or what do you mean you like to get lost in bookstores? That's not manly. But I tell them it's just who I am. For me, it's just I don't focus on gender so much. I just focus on the individual. When it comes down to that, it's more it goes back to even being more of a person. Okay, I'm gonna just look at you as an individual, as a person, who you are coming to me, and let's see what we can do.
Yeah, like what were you told who you needed to be, right, to fit in?
To fit in,
yeah.
You know, because, I mean, it's been a long process for me too, but I've become comfortable enough to go to places where it's like a networking event. And I'm totally fine with just sitting down and just cruising. Like, you know, if people come up to me to talk, I'll talk stories.
Yeah.
But other than that, I'm good at just being there and listen to whoever's talking. But if I got to be in the background, I'm happy with that, you know. And some people, oh, he's being so like off-putting and everything. I was like, well, that's not who I am. But if that's what you think, something's wrong with you then, you know, like kind of thing. But it's taking me a while to get there, just to be comfortable with myself in certain situations. But that's also a way of me dealing with the situation I'm in, right? Like I kind of stick with where I feel safe, you know, but ready for things to come, you know.
Yeah.
But I think for a lot of men, it's, and the guys that I work with, it's just breaking down those barriers. So for me, I put on myself as a responsibility to be vulnerable, you know, with those guys, to kind of share those things, like how I like musicals, you know. They'd be like, what? Musicals? It's like, yeah. Like my family always jokes about, like, you know, if Daniel really wanted to have his life away, it'll be a musical, you know. Like, they're not lying, you know. Like people start dancing down the street, I'll be totally happy, you know. But again, like people are kind of like, that's weird for some people, right? To hear a guy talk about that kind of stuff, or but when I share that, that's just how it is with me. They start sharing things, like kind of letting down the walls, you know. They let down the guard. They can be who they are authentically.
Totally.
You know?
And it's like, you know, I felt like I was at a place where I'm like, oh, you've done a lot of work. You kind of know who you authentically are. And then I still feel like I'm just like this evolving, like being. Like I'm like, oh, you thought you were that. You're actually a little bit more like this. Like the moment I realized, I was like, oh, you're actually more introverted. I was like, weird, because your whole career is based off of social interaction. So it was like, oh, but that again, practice and attunement to just checking in with myself. I was like, okay, well, if I spend all day working with my clients, I definitely need the rest of my afternoon to not have anything social.
Exactly.
My big coaching days, I'm like, okay, I need time the rest of the day to just take my solo walk, my solo hikes, spend time at home, Netflixing Ted Lasso, you know, like just spending time with myself. Yeah. Great show.
you know,
I mean, that's such a great show for so many reasons of vulnerability too, right? Like how much he helps all these masculine athletes, and like he really models like such beautiful humor in ways. But there's so many heart-wrenching moments in that show that I'm like, oh,
I think I watched it. I think I watched that series 3 times already.
I think I went through it twice now.
But it was a great show.
Great show.
With that note, you know, is there any last things you want to kind of share with our listeners out there about the importance of self-reflection and rest?
Yeah, I mean, I think just where we ended off is very important. I think for people to be, you know, reassured of is that it's taken us both in the health and fitness wellness space a long time to learn who we are, to learn what self-awareness means to us and what that looks like when we're activated. So it's this constant practice, and it can feel like a very patient, messy, long process. But it's totally worth it.
Yeah.
I think you and I can agree that we probably are both here based off of our support system and our safe communities, allowing us to be and show up in ways that maybe we've carried our own, you know, judgments and negative, you know, like criticisms around, and they allowed us to belong. And I think that is such an underutilized toolkit, or tool in your toolkit to find safe community. When we can land in that, it's like your body exhales, your whole nervous system is like, thank you, this is what I've been wanting. And you may just notice like how much better you feel emotionally, physically, how your connections in your life start to thrive just based off of like truly finding like that community sense and that belonging. Yeah, great. Well, I think that's all for today. You know, it's such great talking stories with you again. I'm sure I'll have you on in the near future. You know, maybe this would be like a constant like series, you know, because I find that we have a good alignment with what we talk about, and then we bring our own experiences as well. So mahalo for being here today. Thank you so much. Okay, aloha. Mahalo for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this talk story session with Alyssa Chang.
I'll make sure to have the show notes and her information along with all the great work she is doing available over at theKuProject.com. That's the KUProject.com. Now, if this is your first time you are listening to this podcast, feel free to check out the past episodes. And of course, if you haven't already, please leave a review. I'll greatly appreciate it. That's it. That's Pauka Papa, Aloha, and Ahuyo. Keep it cool.